They didn't headline it, they didn't even call it what it is. But behind closed doors, the IMF just triggered the quiet start of global debt forgiveness, and no one's talking about it. This isn't a theory, it's not a prediction, it's already in motion, and most people will only realize what happened after the effects ripple through the system. Let's unpack what really just happened. In June, the IMF released a statement referencing special drawing rights reallocation and debt sustainability frameworks for low-income countries. On the surface, that sounds like standard policy talk, but behind the scenes, it signals something much bigger. What the IMF is doing quietly mirrors the scale of the 2005 G8 Gleneagles debt relief push, but this time, it's happening without headlines or public declarations. The process began with what they call SDR rechanneling. SDRs, or special drawing rights, are international reserve assets created by the IMF and distributed to member countries. Think of them like synthetic currency units that allow global financial balancing without using the dollar. But recently, instead of simply allocating SDRs, the IMF started rechanneling them, moving them from wealthy nations to heavily indebted ones under new lending programs with little to no interest. In other words, they're beginning to absorb unpayable sovereign debts using recycled synthetic capital, quietly, technocratically, and without triggering panic in global bond markets. Why now? Because over 50 countries are either in default or on the brink of it. From Sri Lanka and Ghana to Pakistan and Zambia, sovereign debt is triggering widespread calls for sovereign restructuring. And if these defaults cascade, the entire global lending system could face a crisis of confidence. The IMF knows this, and rather than wait for a 2008-style chain reaction, they're stepping in preemptively. But they're doing it in a way that doesn't spook investors, governments, or the media. That's the brilliance of the current plan. By calling it debt sustainability, they make it sound like reform. But what they're actually doing is absorbing toxic sovereign debt and replacing it with soft IMF liabilities, resetting the board without rewriting the rules. And the implications are massive. Because once the IMF sets this precedent for low-income countries, the structure is already in place to expand the same model to mid-tier economies. Argentina, Egypt, Turkey, even Italy could eventually benefit from SDR-based restructuring. But there's a catch. This system only works as long as confidence in the IMF remains strong. SDRs are not backed by any hard asset. They're based on a basket of major currencies, including the dollar, euro, yen, and yuan. If any of those come under serious strain, the SDR model weakens, which leads to the next domino. China is already proposing a new version of SDRs, one backed by commodities like gold and oil. At recent BRICS summits, they've been openly floating the idea of a BRICS coin, a multi-asset reserve system designed to replace dollar-based lending entirely. So while the IMF is quietly resetting debts through SDR reallocation, China has floated an alternative reserve model, potentially backed by commodities like gold and oil, as a long-term rival to IMF-led SDR systems. A parallel system is being built in real time, and very few people are connecting the dots. Now pause and consider the timing. Global sovereign debt just crossed $97 trillion. The U.S. alone is carrying over $34.8 trillion in federal debt, and interest payments are now the single largest line item in the national budget. We're not just approaching a tipping point, we're already past it. The only question now is how the reset unfolds and who controls the rules. Here's where things get even more strategic. The IMF's SDR mechanism gives it the power to pick winners and losers, deciding which countries get restructuring relief and which remain in the old debt paradigm. This gives unelected global financial authorities influence over national policies, from taxation to energy subsidies, in exchange for debt relief. It's economic leverage disguised as humanitarian aid, and it's being sold as a solution. But when you strip away the branding, what you're left with is the IMF becomes the central arbiter of sovereign solvency. And if this model expands, you're looking at a world where central banks are no longer the primary lenders of last resort. The IMF becomes the real power center, not just advising nations, but actively restructuring their economies from the top down. This also has implications for digital currencies. While the IMF has published research exploring digital payment infrastructure, major economies, including the United States, have rejected centralized digital currencies altogether. Any future integration is likely to remain voluntary and region-specific. That's not speculation. In 2023, the IMF launched a CBDC handbook outlining how national digital currencies could eventually plug into cross-border settlement systems. Some insiders believe this could become a quiet prerequisite for participation in future SDR-based programs and plug into SDR reallocation mechanisms. And in 2024, the G20 endorsed further development of cross-border payment systems using digital settlement protocols. In plain English, that means programmable currencies that can be turned on or off based on compliance. This is about more than debt. It's about reshaping how money works at the global level. And if you're still wondering why this isn't headline news, it's because the architecture is being laid piece by piece, acronym by acronym, wrapped in complex policy language. But the real cost is felt when countries quietly remove fuel subsidies or restructure agriculture, often under the radar of public debate. No drama, no announcement, just quiet execution. But the consequences are enormous. In the next few years, we could see entire regions of the world operating under a new financial logic, where debts are no longer paid but absorbed, and sovereignty becomes conditional on IMF compliance. This isn't speculation. It's a strategic restructuring, one that exchanges liquidity for policy alignment behind closed doors, because forgiveness always comes with fine print. And unless you're paying attention to the paperwork, you'll miss the shift until your own country's monetary system starts to reflect it. The global reset isn't some future event. It's unfolding quietly, right now, and if you're not watching the structure, you'll wake up inside it. If this opened your eyes, subscribe. We break down what others ignore and track the financial shifts shaping your future. There's another layer most analysts are missing. Debt forgiveness, even when rebranded as SDR reallocation, fundamentally shifts the accountability structure of global finance. In the traditional system, if a country defaulted, consequences followed. Downgrade credit ratings, capital flight, austerity. Painful, but predictable. Now with IMF-led forgiveness mechanisms, there's an embedded political cost. Debt relief comes with conditions, often quiet, often confidential, that steer policy decisions behind closed doors. Energy subsidies get cut. Farming practices change. Infrastructure priorities shift. This is not about benevolence. It's about leverage. And that leverage is being deployed through non-transparent instruments that circumvent democratic accountability. Elected officials sign agreements behind closed doors. Citizens only find out when policies suddenly change. Take Zambia. In 2023, after securing IMF debt support, the government removed fuel subsidies as part of its agreed fiscal plan. Protests followed, but the conditions were already in place through policy coordination, not public negotiation. And that's just the beginning. As more nations opt into SDR restructuring, a new class of obligations emerges, ones not recorded in domestic debt statistics, but deeply tied to domestic outcomes. Think of it as shadow governance, operating through liquidity. Even central banks are being reshaped. To qualify for IMF restructuring, countries are being advised to adopt new monetary frameworks, including inflation targeting, open capital flows, and digital infrastructure upgrades. In other words, the blueprint for a programmable, IMF-compatible monetary system. And this blueprint is converging. If this breakdown opened your eyes, subscribe, because you won't find this anywhere else, and what's coming next won't wait for headlines.